Welcome back. Today we are diving into part 2 of our explainer of Tangible Power of Shared Imagination by Phumlani Methey. Specifically, we're looking at episode 1, Money, the greatest collective fiction in human history. In part 1, we trace the historical chain of monetary belief all the way from the 1500s right up through the British Empire. Now we're picking up the thread after World War II. We're going to begin a forensic deconstruction of how the United States inherited that system and how they transformed the global financial architecture into a globally mandated belief system. We're going to walk through the Bretton Woods Agreement, the Nixon shock, the birth of the petrodollar, and ultimately the enforcement of dollar dominance through military force. Let's get right into it.
Think about the last time you filled your car at a petrol station. Every single time you stand at that pump, you are entirely unknowingly participating in a clandestine 1973 political agreement that fundamentally structured the modern world. You weren't in the room. Nobody asked for your consent. But every single nation on Earth that requires oil to function, which, mathematically speaking, is every industrializing and developed nation on the planet, is strictly bound by that exact agreement. Because that single arrangement decreed that oil could only be bought and sold using one specific currency, the US dollar. The price on that pump, the currency you're using, the invisible economic forces dictating that everyday transaction, they all trace back to one single moment. But before we unpack the precise mechanism of that agreement, we really have to ask the forensic question: how exactly did we get here?
Section 1. The Origin. The Bretton Woods Consensus.
To understand our present reality, we actually need to understand a fundamental rule of human society first. Back in 1928, the sociologist W.I. Thomas proved that objective truth matters far less than perceived reality. This is known today as the Thomas theorem. It simply states, if men define situations as real, they are real in their consequences. To really grasp this, just think of a classic bank run. If depositors merely believe a bank is insolvent, even if that bank's balance sheet is perfectly healthy and all the money is safely locked in the vault, they're going to panic. They will rush to withdraw their funds. And those subsequent panicked withdrawals will actually bankrupt the bank. The belief produced the exact reality it predicted. So the crucial point we have to hold on to here is this: if enough people define a situation as real and act accordingly, the consequences become entirely, objectively real.
Now keep that psychological theorem in mind, because it became the literal architecture of our modern economy. Let's go back to July 1944. World War II is still raging, but the victorious Allies are already gathering to establish a new baseline for the global economy. At a secluded hotel in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, representatives from 44 nations made a world-altering decision. You see, at the time, the sheer devastation of Europe meant the United States held the vast majority of the world's physical gold reserves, which was the traditional foundation of wealth. Because of this unparalleled leverage, these 44 nations agreed to peg their national currencies directly to the US dollar. The dollar itself was then pegged to physical gold at a fixed rate of $35 per ounce. Just like that, the US dollar became the indisputable global anchor. The entire global financial system was securely lashed to a single piece of paper.
This historic agreement brilliantly illustrates the Thomas theorem applied on a massive global scale. Because these 44 nations collectively defined the dollar as the central anchor of wealth, the entire machinery of international trade began to settle exclusively in dollars. Nations held their foreign exchange reserves in dollars. Massive global institutions like the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank operated entirely in dollars. This international consensus literally constructed the economy, producing a very real, very tangible global financial system based purely on a shared definition. The world believed the dollar was as good as gold, and therefore, in its consequences, it absolutely was.
Section 2. The Fracture. The 1971 Nixon Shock.
But what happens when the physical reality no longer matches the collective belief? To understand the peril of what came next, we have to look at a fundamental philosophical discovery. Back in 1781, the philosopher Immanuel Kant established that humans never experience reality as it actually is in itself. He called that underlying objective state the noumenon. Instead, Kant argued, we only ever experience reality as our mind actively constructs and filters it, which he called the phenomenon. Think about it this way. You never actually experience the intrinsic physical value of a piece of paper with a dollar sign printed on it. You only experience the agreed-upon social phenomenon of its purchasing power. The phenomenon is the shared illusion we all just agree to navigate. Fast forward to the 1960s, and that social construction was in imminent critical danger. The American economic landscape was rapidly transforming. Enormous spending on the Vietnam War, combined with massive domestic initiatives, caused severe financial strain. The printing presses were running incredibly hot. Soon, the sheer volume of paper dollars circulating around the globe began to vastly exceed the actual physical gold locked in U.S. vaults backing them. Nations grew highly suspicious.
They realized this massive disparity and began actively demanding their physical gold in exchange for their paper dollars. France in particular led the charge, threatening to expose the entire global illusion. The math was staggering. Foreign governments were holding over $50 billion in claims, but the United States had only $10 billion in gold to cover them. The mathematical reality was undeniable. The United States was essentially bankrupt.
The system was visibly breaking, and drastic measures were required to stop a total collapse. So, on August 15, 1971, President Richard Nixon appeared on national television and executed what is now historically known as the Nixon shock. He abruptly and completely unilaterally ended the convertibility of the US dollar to gold. Without consulting a single one of the other 43 nations from the original Bretton Woods Conference, the physical foundation of the global economy was completely severed. The agreement that had stabilized international finance for 27 years was dissolved overnight. The dollar was officially unmoored.
Now, you might be wondering, why didn't the global economy instantly collapse into ruin the very next morning? Well, this is exactly where Kant's theory applied perfectly. The phenomenon survived the loss of the noumenon. Even though the physical gold anchor, that underlying reality, was completely removed, the shared experience and collective belief in the dollar's value persisted unharmed. The world was just so used to transacting in dollars that they simply kept doing it out of habit and necessity. The paper was now backed by absolutely nothing but faith. But faith is incredibly fragile, and the dollar urgently needed a new foundation to prevent an inevitable collapse.
Section 3. The Petrodollar Contagion.
The United States knew this system running purely on faith wouldn't last. 2 years later, they discovered that the most powerful way to enforce a global belief system isn't through gold at all. It is through oil. But how do you get the whole world to adopt a completely unbacked currency system? You leverage crowd psychology. In his seminal 1895 book, The Crowd, Gustave Le Bon theorized that when individuals form a crowd, their critical, independent capacity dissolves into a collective entity. Beliefs spread rapidly through this collective via psychological contagion. A nation, acting in the global arena, operates much like an individual in a crowd. It looks around, sees what everyone else is doing, and it conforms. You believe and you participate simply because everyone else believes and participates.
The architects of American financial power engineered a pivot that would alter the course of history. In 1973, U.S. Secretary of State Henry Kissinger traveled to Saudi Arabia to strike a masterstroke of geopolitical leverage. He secured a landmark agreement where Saudi Arabia would price all of its oil sales exclusively in U.S. dollars. In exchange, the United States would provide the Saudi kingdom with advanced weapons and guaranteed military protection in a highly volatile region. It was a perfect marriage of convenience, negotiated in the shadows, yet impacting every citizen on the globe. And because Saudi Arabia was the dominant force in global energy, within a year, the rest of the OPEC nations naturally followed suit. All OPEC oil was now priced exclusively in dollars. The petrodollar was officially born.
Let's synthesize this using Le Bon's theory. Oil is the foundational energy source of all modern industrial production. Because every single industrializing nation requires oil to simply survive and keep their lights on, they are structurally forced to hold US dollars to buy it. They don't hold dollars because they philosophically believe in the strength of the American economy. They hold them because they have absolutely no choice. This created a self-reinforcing contagion of belief across the global crowd of nations. Every time a nation accepted dollar pricing to buy their essential energy, they quietly validated and enforced the belief system for every other nation.
Section 4. The enforcement sequence, the dollar or the bomb. This brilliantly engineered system created a stark, unforgiving new reality. Leaving the petrodollar system is not just a simple economic policy shift for a sovereign nation. The historical record shows it carries lethal, catastrophic consequences. Let's dispassionately examine what happens when a nation attempts to break this contagion of belief. In the year 2000, Iraq officially announced it would begin selling its oil in euros instead of dollars. The documented consequence was a 2003 U.S. invasion and the complete dismantling of its government. In 2009, Libya proposed a Pan-African gold dinar to be used exclusively for continental oil trades. The documented consequence was a 2011 NATO intervention and the execution of its leader. Since 1979, Iran has aggressively pushed for non-dollar trading mechanisms. The consequence has been decades of continuous crippling economic sanctions and total isolation. Again, these are not political opinions. These are the chronological, documented facts of modern history.
What we are looking at here is the Thomas theorem operating through raw military force. The dollar is defined as real and defined as strictly mandatory by the world's largest and most well-funded military. The consequences of defying that definition, invasions, regime changes, devastating economic strangulation, are profoundly real. And those very real, highly visible consequences are exactly what strictly enforce the collective belief for everyone else. When a nation observes what happens to those who step outside the consensus, their participation is completely guaranteed. The modern global financial system is not backed by gold, it is backed by the military.
But history always offers a stark warning. The eschatology, the final destiny or ultimate conclusion of monetary empires, shows a distinct and entirely unavoidable pattern. Every single previous dominant system has eventually ended: the Roman denarius, the British pound sterling, and as history clearly shows us with the overextended Roman legions and the vast British navy, military powers simply cannot enforce a collective fiction indefinitely. The sheer cost of policing the globe inevitably drains the empire's resources. Eventually, the enforcement mechanism becomes far too expensive to maintain.
Which leaves us with one final, unavoidable thought to take away from all of this. If the entire global economic system rests on a foundation of belief, and if the dollar is ultimately backed by bombs, what happens when the bombs are no longer enough?